I know that I'm not what is being said about me either. I think we should watch Pasolini and read the Marquis de Sade and read extremist literature of all kinds. I've basically been sacrificed twice.
Welcome to a somewhat unusual episode of UnHerd. It's the story of an intellectual called Nina Power, a philosopher and until recently senior editor at Compact magazine, who, having been cancelled multiple times for espousing political opinions that are considered edgy or unacceptable, eventually sued someone for defamation for calling her anti-Semitic, among other things. He then countersued, and that legal drama has taken more than 5 years, at the end of which both sides lost. But because of the revelations of that case, and because of the requirement to bear his legal costs, Nina now finds herself out of a job and bankrupt. The purpose of this interview is not to relitigate every aspect of the trial, nor to sit in judgment. She has been through the trial for quite enough time already. But there's something about this unusual story that is unmistakably of the 2020s. So Nina is here with us in the studio. Welcome, Nina.
Thank you, Freddie.
Let's begin by just putting the audience into the right perspective of what actually happened. So the protagonists in this case are yourself. As I said in the introduction, you're a writer, you're a philosopher, you've written about masculinity, you've had views on the gender issue, but you're primarily interested in the arts. You're an art critic and involved in that world. And your co-litigant, someone called D.C. Miller. Tell us about him.
Oh, well, Daniel was amazing. He's a very good friend of mine. He's a literary editor for IM 1776, which is a fantastic magazine. Sometimes
called far right by its opponents.
This use of the phrase far right, I think is, overworn and generally inaccurate. I think it's also stems from the situation in which almost everything that isn't this very specific drop from the sky set of ideological positions is then deemed to be far right.
An edgy, interesting magazine, let's call it.
Yeah, I don't know. Are people who are interested in ideas and being curious edgy by definition? I don't think so, but in any case, it's a very interesting magazine.
So before we go on to the person that you and Daniel took a legal case against, you yourself have some history in terms of you've been cancelled, possibly once, possibly twice, possibly multiple times. Just give us a little bit of background on that.
Okay, so I was writing for The Guardian and generally sort of an activist around the student fee protests. I was already an academic. I was writing and thinking about protest and policing, freedom of expression, freedom of association. And the stuff around the proposed changes to the Gender Recognition Act started happening. So from about 2014, 15, 16, 17, there was this other conversation that was going on that wasn't really reminiscent of the earlier concerns of the left, which I would have regarded myself as being a part of, which was to do with class, to do with inequality, to do with actually a kind of playfulness in art and culture, humour, good humour. Generally the idea that you would meet people where they were, right? We campaigned to stop higher education becoming this commercial consumerist thing, which it did, and all of the implications of that, or clientelism, it no longer being a place of intellectual inquiry, but really a sort of hotbed of ideological terror.
And then on this gender issue, you suddenly fell foul of your stablemates on the left.
Basically, I was a member of the Labour Party, right, not a very active one. I sort of knew Jeremy Corbyn a bit because he'd been very involved in the student protests. He was a very good grassroots politician, whatever you think of him as a potential PM. So suddenly there was all this stuff around women being suspended for wanting to have a conversation about changing the words, the meaning of the words man and woman. And I watched videos of like Helen Steele, who was a hero of the left. She stood up to McDonald's. She'd won her case against them. She had been spied upon by police. She was a really big hero of the anarchist left and the left in general. And suddenly she was being denounced. And I was like, Helen Steele was being denounced by the left. And, it turned out that she'd said, well, can we have a conversation about this, right? Before we rush into changing the law and changing the meaning of words, And she said, I don't even know the answer. She didn't say, here's my position and I'm sticking to it and this is the hill I'm going to die on. She said, can we talk about it?
And you then wrote in defence of her and in defence of the idea that it's up for discussion and it didn't get down very well, to say the least.
I mean, I'd suffered like cognitive dissonance for about 1 or 2 years, basically, because I was like, kept trying to think about it and nothing really made sense. And every time I tried to speak to people about it, they were like, I don't want to talk about this with you.
So you got embroiled in that argument pretty early, actually, long before it was a sort of mainstream in the culture war, and you suffered quite a harsh and early cancellation.
Yeah, so I mean, actually, there were quite a few women like Julie Bindel and others, and radical feminists who'd been cancelled really hard before me, actually, for a long time, and I didn't really understand what that was. But yeah, so 2018, I posted something on Facebook, actually. I said what the F is going on in the Labour Party, because I'd read some transcripts with some women who had been suspended. I didn't know any of them. They'd been suspended and they'd secretly recorded their interrogations and leaked them online, and the transcripts were like frightening. I mean, they were basically being shouted at by Labour Party members for their views, or for even wanting to have a conversation. And I was like, this is really weird and this is really bad. What
practical impact did it have on your life?
So I got dropped for the music magazine, The Wire, which I was very fond of writing for. It was more kind of social friendship group at this point.
So that's what you kind of have coming into this dispute we're going to hear about. Meanwhile, the person you and Daniel eventually sued is a writer and artist called Luke Turner. And he himself had experienced some background before entering this kind of disagreement. That's right? So he was part of an artistic project, HWNDU, He Will Not Divide Us, which was a kind of conceptual art Trump protest, basically, where lots of people on the right, or people who didn't agree with his framing of it, kind of piled on him somewhat. So he had a bad experience and probably did experience genuinely threatening behaviour during that earlier episode, coming into this before your interaction even happened. Is that fair?
I mean, I'd also like to add that Daniel, my co-claimant, had himself been very cancelled in 2017 because he counter-protested the shutdown of LD50, which was an art gallery in Hackney, which was accused of having months earlier hosted a conference online, I think, about neo-reaction, right? Which is then, when Trump was elected, people were very angry and they decided to go and smash up the gallery and close it, which they did. And the curator, the owner of the gallery, which had hosted many now quite famous artists, including Turner Prize winners, by the way, had to flee the country or felt that she had to. It was violent. And Daniel counter-protested it and got sort of harassed and attacked. And from that moment on, he was demonised as a Nazi, a fascist, and so on and so forth.
So basically you have three individuals, each of whom feels quite strongly that they have suffered kind of wrongful, intense attacks. And then it comes to a head with pretty much mainly Twitter exchanges between the three of you. Suddenly, within the year of 2018, you find that you're in a lawsuit suing someone who's now counter-suing you.
So, first of all, I mean, defamation or this whole legal civil process is like quite weird. It's not what you think. You think, oh, well, he hasn't told the truth. Surely if we just show that he hasn't told the truth, like, it will all be resolved. And it's not really like that at all. This is a kind of sort of fantasy we have about how things work.
So he calls you an anti-Semitic art world figure and that you're complicit in a violent anti-Semitic harassment campaign and allegedly sent emails to people encouraging them not to use your work.
Oh, yes.
In terms of Daniel, Luke Turner claimed there was a police investigation into Daniel Miller for death threats and that Daniel Miller had written an article entitled Towards a Hitlerian Disability Politics. Meanwhile, Daniel Miller then engages on Twitter, and to read out a couple of the tweets that he sent to Luke, he calls Luke a dumb as fuck, dishonest, propaganda hack cocksucker and a pathologically dishonest careerist retard shitbag. So that gives you a bit of a flavour. At the very least, this is not a productive and happy relationship.
We have to understand that what we're trying to do at this point is defend other people, right? The problem with the defamation case is you have to bring it in your own name. One of the aspects. You can't bring it on behalf of all of the other people who are being attacked, and maybe they don't live in the UK and they can't bring a case. But there's a kind of strong sense in which you want to defend people. Like, we wanted to defend people who are being defamed.
So you were trying to prove that point. I mean, because a lot of, I think the first question people will want an answer to is, when it hasn't really worked out how you had hoped, why did you engage in this process even from the start, when it seemed to be mainly Daniel Miller's issue, and the chances of success, given the threshold that needs to be cleared to prove a defamation case, maybe weren't that good?
Right. I mean, I will say that I was naive in some ways, and that's not a defence, that's an admission of perhaps an aspect of my character which is needs work. I would say, though, that one thing that maybe isn't easy to understand is, why would you launch a case in the first place? Like, why would you bring a defamation case? The thing is, we didn't want to. And what we wanted to do was resolve this immediately, far before it came to trial. But what happened was, because of the counter-filing, he said, and by the way, he spent £1.3 million, Mishcon de Rea.
That's a very expensive
Very, very
law firm.
expensive. They were sending us legal letters every week at points. It was absolutely horrible. He wouldn't sit down with us. We said repeatedly, just delete. Look, the point is, these are factually untrue claims. Okay, this isn't a matter of opinion. It's not like saying, I don't know, Freddie is...
Say whatever you like, Nina. It's a free speech here.
It's not like saying, oh, Freddie can be a bit arrogant sometimes or something. You know what I mean? Like, fine, okay.
That's it. I'm suing you, Nina.
Yeah,
that's defamation.
that might sting for a second,
Yeah.
right?
No,
but
if you said Freddie is a paedophile...
Right.
That would
that's
be
inherently defamatory. Right. And actually, one of the interesting questions, a serious question actually, is whether it is inherently defamatory to call somebody anti-Semitic or not when they aren't. Right. I think this is an unanswered question as yet.
So you had hoped, it sounds like,
yes,
to prove a point, or to use a lawsuit as a means to resolve it, or maybe make a point
Well,
clear.
Initially, we sent some letters, that's all. We said, please, can you delete these factually untrue claims? So by claiming that Daniel had written an article defending Hitler, I mean, this title, this is like a claim about a whole article, which, by the way, doesn't exist and no one has ever written. You're claiming this. You're claiming that...
But he did, I believe, take that down.
After months and months and months, he left up the claim. It's in the trial. He left it up for, I think, 7 months.
So on the substance of your claim, the defamation claim, the judge decided that although there were factually untrue things said about you, and although she expressed that it must have been very uncomfortable for you, in her view, it didn't pass the threshold of a provable harm.
Yes. So one of the issues is also to do with defamation law in the internet age. So in the newspaper age, if someone published an article and it said, like, last week Freddie killed a cat and you hadn't killed a cat, and then people were avoiding you and dropping you because you'd killed a cat, you would be able to say, this article caused these harms. Whereas in the internet age, it's very miasmic. Right, a tweet is counted as a publication in the same way that an entire newspaper article would have been counted out. And I'm not a legal expert, right? So maybe I'm putting this, perhaps badly. But what's going on in this kind of...
It's harder than it used to be to prove the direct link between a specific publication and a specific harm.
Yes.
And that's the requirement of a defamation suit, in the UK at least. Yes,
the serious harm aspect, you have to sort of prove a direct causation.
You are a free speech minded person. In a way, it's not a kind of very free speech approach to try and sue someone for what they've been saying about you. And I guess you could make the case that it's a good thing that it's a very high bar. Should we not be reassured that your defamation case was unsuccessful, because it shows that we still at least have quite a free speech society?
Yeah, to some degree. But I think there is a kind of crucial difference between free speech or free expression and defamation, right? I mean, like, to go back to the killing a cat example, either you killed a cat or you didn't. Do you know what I mean? And one could say much worse things about you and say, oh, it's just my opinion, right? But there is a difference between factual claims, especially factual claims when they're designed to ruin your life. So we know that there are certain things, if you call people, they will be, and they're not that. If they're not that, they will be very, very, very upset with you.
Why did you sue him if you believed in free speech?
There is a difference between fact and opinion. And I think, okay, we live in this postmodern sea and everything on the internet is just whatever, post-truth or whatever. But I think that can't be right. And it can't be right about saying there are two sexes, right? This is a statement of fact. It's not a matter of opinion, right? And if we give up on the distinction between fact and opinion, we're really in trouble. Then it's just a matter of power. Then it's just whoever gets to say the loudest or has the most money or whatever wins.
He countersued almost immediately, and his claim was for harassment, and that was thrown out as well. So in a similar way, the judge determined that although, and she's quite critical of some of the behaviour you and Daniel did show towards him, and we'll go into that, she also concluded that although basically it wasn't very nice, it shouldn't be illegal, and that she dismissed his claim. She didn't find in support of his claim. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, she said it didn't rise to the quasi-criminal level needed for it to count as harassment.
Let me read a couple of things from the judge's note and see how you respond to them. So in reference to his claim, she said, for example, there is, in particular, a relentless pursuit of the theme of Turner's mental deficiency or mental illness, in addition to the use of retard, low IQ, sociopathic, paranoid, deranged, obsessive, paranoid schizophrenic, dangerously mentally ill, and so on, sometimes accompanied by messages to get help. She then says, Ms. Power told me from the witness box that the latter proceeded from genuine and empathetic concern. I was unconvinced. So that's her summary, is that she says this could, on an objective basis, fairly be described as bullying. Do you think that's fair?
To be clear, I did say that I thought he was paranoid, and I did say that I thought he should get help, and I actually meant it. The judge has her opinion. She thought that I wasn't compassionate, but I actually was. I'm extremely compassionate for the human part of him that thinks he has to do this to other people in order to, make his way in the world. Some of the things that Daniel said, as he admitted, were ill-tempered, but Twitter is this kind of insane place. I did say that I thought he was paranoid. Okay, I'm not able really to make a judgment, but having been paranoid myself in the past, like in situations of terrible mental state, I did feel sorry for him, because if he thought that there was a campaign of people organising to persecute him, that would be a horrible feeling for any human being to have.
One which you know yourself.
Yes, and I wanted him to not feel that. I wanted him to basically take a step back and understand that the world wasn't against him.
Some of the other examples I think are worth going through here. So you quoted on Twitter at length Andre Breton's proposition that the simplest surrealist act consists of dashing down into the street, pistol in hand, and firing blindly into the crowd. And you sent him a still image, which I think we can put on the screen, from a film showing a heretic about to be burned at the stake. This is to give context to the judge is trying to put some context around his claim of intimidation or threat of violence.
Right. The Andre Breton quote is a surrealist quote. Daniel at times defines himself as a surrealist. I was pretending to be him. We had a little game with the cartoons of each other in our own names, by the way. These are not secret accounts. They were joke we had between ourselves. And it was, everybody knows that quote. Everybody knows it's from Breton's manifesto. It's very famous. I'm not saying that this is what people should do. I'm not saying that this is what art is.
So then the other aspect was antisemitism. That was part of his harassment claim. Luke Turner is Jewish. As it happens, so is Daniel Miller of Jewish heritage. The judge concluded that there may perhaps be inferred into their conduct towards Mr. Turner something of an aware relish for the frisson of danger of their discourse. Does that sound fair?
No, no, not at all. I think what was going on here is this accusation of anti-Semitism, which is very serious. It has deleterious effects. If I call you an anti-Semite in public, right? This is not great, right? You were going to have to sort of deal with the fallout if somebody with many followers tweets that, for example, you know. And how do I put it? In the trial, not a single thing I've ever written or said in all of my years of writing and speaking, which is many at this point, more than 20, there are hundreds, if not thousands of hours of me speaking. There are hundreds and thousands of my words. Not a single thing I've ever publicly said or written was brought to demonstrate this claim that I was an anti-Semite. The only case he tried to make, which didn't work, was you had correspondence with people, you were talking to people, you wrote something in somewhere, it was with somebody or for somebody.
So a lot of association.
Yeah, just complete guilt by association, third-party stuff, nothing I've ever said. What I think he means by anti-Semitic, because he was calling lots of people anti-Semitic, is someone who disagrees with me. I didn't even know he was Jewish. As I say in the trial, it wouldn't have mattered. I just thought what he was doing was wrong. I just thought he was a bully. I didn't think, you know, any of his behaviour comes from him being Jewish. That would be mental, right? Like, it's he said that because I said he was from a wealthy family, or he's, that was anti-Semitic. But it's not anti-Semitic to say that somebody's rich. I know lots of Jewish people who are not rich, and I know lots of rich people who are not Jewish. And I know poor people who are Jewish and poor people who are not Jewish. Like, there is no inherent connection between, Jewishness and wealth. You
felt that was imagined, or?
I think it was cynical. I think it was like saying, I don't know, it's like a kind of weird mask or a shield. It's like saying, even if it's true, because I say in the trial, but it's true. It's not anti-Semitic for me to say that you are a director of a company, or, if it's true, right? Or is merely saying it anti-Semitic. It can't be, right? It can't be the case that saying something is true is anti-Semitic because the person happens to be Jewish.
So the judge basically said that neither claim passed the threshold. However, in her decision about who has to pay for it, she pretty much decided against you. So you had to pay 80% of his costs as well as your own. And that has actually literally bankrupted both you and Daniel. Mm-hmm. What is your kind of reflection on that? Now that's all happened, do you feel it's been injustice? Do you feel regretful? How do you look back on that whole process?
No, because I stood up for a principle, and I stood with my friend, and we tried to say, like, this bullying is unacceptable, and this making these claims, factually untrue claims about people, is not how we should proceed in civil society. And I mean, if you don't really have any assets, like, bankruptcy isn't that bad. You get like a nice woman who just sort of says, well, tell me what you have, and we'll sort it out. It's like, it's not, he's not going to get any money.
Let's try and work out what is kind of useful or interesting about the whole experience for the world, so that some good can come out of it. One thing that I think to many of our viewers and to me was interesting was the kind of tone of the scene, the intellectual scene that you're in. It evidently interested the judge as well. She devoted whole pages to trying to describe what she called the new right milieu. She called it new right, neo-reactionary, dark enlightenment, accelerationism, alt-right, far-right, neo-fascist, neo-Nazi. We definitely don't need to go through each of those. I know you will reject probably most of them, but this was quite interesting, I thought, the way she describes it. I wonder if you think this is fair. Its natural medium is the internet. It eludes clear categorizations and labels. It moves fluidly between high ideals and low humour. It oscillates between the serious on the one hand and the playful, performative, provocative or disruptive on the other. It enjoys irony and satire. Do you think that's fair? That's a good description of that intellectual scene?
Yeah, I mean, that could have described left-wing culture as well, like 20 years ago. I think being curious about the world and wanting to be humorous, and actually to be humorous in order to deal with the world, like, these are good things. It
feels to me, having read some of the exchanges you had under the cover of irony, maybe as a protective mechanism, that's the the only way that some of these ideas can be expressed.
I think in a liberal society, like, we all know what the limits are of things that we can and can't talk about, right? And that includes things that are true, right? The fact that, for example, saying that human beings can't change sex became verboten, became unspeakable, right? To me, that was a kind of a moment of, I don't know, great awakening and injustice, because what on earth? You know, the fact that women and others were being punished for stating things that, like, the entire human history knew to be true, every religion, every myth had taken for granted, suddenly became verboten, right? This is authoritarianism, you know, and I don't want to live in a world in which people can't say things that they feel are true, you know, and I was being punished for wanting to talk about changes to legislation, changes to the meaning of words. So I could already see how authoritarian this was.
And do you think that kind of tone, which is sort of ironical, often not immediately sincere, is a response to that? Do you think that whole sort of type of online discourse, which is particularly prevalent on the right, I think, is a reaction to that? Is that how best to understand the ironic tone, that it's kind of the only way to even hint at things?
I mean, in a way, I would say that the right doesn't even really exist. I think that there are people who are curious and want to talk about reality and have interesting conversations. And then there are like a load of authoritarians going, no, you can't. And if you do, I'm going to like ruin your life. So I think people are naturally curious, and I think they want to talk about things, especially when people are saying, no, you can't. Like, you can't talk about this, you can't talk about it. It's like, why? Why can't I talk about it? Like, you're not more intelligent than me. A lot of people doing this are, like, frankly stupid. You know, and I'm not going to be told what I can and can't say by someone who's frankly dumb and, you know, threatening me.
More recently, earlier this month, in fact, Luke, the person you were attempting to sue, released a whole bunch of transcripts of private WhatsApp messages you had with your co-litigant and friend, Daniel Miller. And they have now gone all over the internet. But your WhatsApp chats with Daniel became evidence because you were trying to disprove the conspiracy aspect of what he was alleging in his harassment claim. So if you could show that you weren't actually conspiring privately with Daniel to harass Luke Turner, you could show that that wasn't true. So you volunteered your private WhatsApp chats for the whole period to try and prove that.
Yes.
And in the process, you sort of accidentally, or as part of that process, highlighted some exchanges that sound politically edgy to people and has now started a whole new front, I suppose, a whole new series of accusations against you. Yeah,
but to be clear, we gave him 200 pages, more than 200 pages of our WhatsApp chat, in which it was clear that we weren't talking about him. You know, I mentioned him like 2 or 3 times just to say he's talking about LD50 or whatever. These are chats between two friends who are very close, spending a lot of time together, who have also been socially ostracised already. We're being called fascists and Nazis and whatever constantly. You know, I'm basically completely ostracised by the left at this point. People are publishing horrible stuff about me already. Like, you know, it's a pretty isolated position. I was also recovering from addiction issues. It's not a very nice place to be. I was also unemployed. I'd left all my jobs and been sacked from various things. You know, I was pretty isolated.
These are conversations you were not intended for publication.
They're funny. They're jokey conversations between two people who like love and care about each other and have a dull sense of humour. Of course, they're not public. He took very selected extracts from the private chats and then framed them and presented them to make them look miasmically evil, which is kind of what he's been doing the whole way through, like conjuring up this idea that we're really bad, and that if somebody jokes and says, like as I do at some point, you know, oh, I'm definitely a Nazi now, lol, because I'm criticising some piece of woke literature or something, that this is actually an admission of my real, true political position, even though, as I say, in the trial, not a single piece of any of my writing or speech was brought to demonstrate.
I found them interesting, if I'm allowed to say that. You know that everybody's read them, so there's no revelation there. I think maybe it gives you a chance to kind of explain what you meant by them, because some people will have read them and not explain it. So let's just go through a couple of them. There's one where you describe a kind of experience you had. This is all the way back in 2018, an experience you had on a bus. So you say, I wonder if the social disapproval for racism is a psyop to stop people realising that there are alien and fairy races. He then says, good take. You said, yeah. And you say, well, I had it. When I saw all these things, I also thought, oh no, I can't think this. It's wrong. Also, that black and white were alien races and very different. Seriously. He then says, yes, you should not reveal this to most people. That's definitely true. They can't handle it. And you go on at some length about the aliens on the bus. What was the aliens on the bus experience?
Well, I mean, I would just like to restate that this is a private chat, a fleeting private chat between two friends in 2018. I didn't even have a copy of these chats. Daniel somehow had a copy. And I think that everybody's private chats or group chats would probably have stuff in them that, if taken out of context, would look weird. This is a conversation I'd already had with Daniel about something that actually happened to me in 2011 when I hadn't slept for 17 weeks. I was very upset about what had happened to Alfie, my previous boyfriend, who was still very close with, who had been almost killed by the police and was now being put on trial. And I was very, very, very upset. I didn't sleep properly for 17 weeks. I was completely insane at this point. I knew that I was entering into a very bad state. I think it was kind of like a psychotic break, basically. I started seeing things, like people's faces were melting. I started hallucinating, and like words were going like really weird, like they were having a very strange effect on my body. It was like very hard to explain, but I definitely knew something wasn't right. And I went to work, but I'd somehow gotten the wrong bus. And I started seeing things. I saw these aliens, as I thought, and it didn't change when I look back, right? Like I thought,
other people on the bus appeared like aliens.
But like I say, they were friendly, right? So I wasn't, do you know what I mean? I'm not saying like it was hostile or, it was just a very bizarre experience. And then I somehow overheard them telepathically saying, she's not supposed to be able to see us, right? And like, I knew something was like not okay. I was like, okay, I was basically in a twilight world at this point. Like,
and how is that racial? I mean, was it the black people were aliens or the white people were aliens?
It's a joke about the word race, right? So when we talk about the fairy race and alien race, it was a joke about race. So the idea of the psyop is racism, like the idea of races, which I don't really believe in, by the way, and I think that actually the current liberal sort of weird thing is actually really racist, to be honest. That whatever you want to call it, woke mind virus or whatever, there is a racism at the heart of this current iteration of liberalism,
which is dwelling overly on race and identity.
Right,
but exactly. I was just trying to get to, maybe there is some insight in that kind of crazy moment you had on the bus.
Yeah, maybe.
What was it?
I think that basically
what is the alien race?
Well, we are. I mean, all of us, the human race is the alien race. No, but I think that when people have serious mental issues like I was having in this moment, and I'm trying to deal with it, I'm still trying to deal with it, like 7 years later, and I'm talking to my trusted friend about this awful, frankly, experience, like terrifying experience. But I think a lot of what mental illness is, the way it manifests itself, is through transgressive thoughts, because a lot of the time we are policing ourselves, right? We're self-censoring. We know implicitly or explicitly when we're punished what it is we are and aren't allowed to say. And I think this was a moment where something like breaks through, and that's why I say, like, I thought I can't be thinking this, right? Because it's from the liberal point of view, from the current ideological climate, it's absolutely unacceptable.
But what was unacceptable about it? Why would the current liberal climate have not allowed you to see aliens on a bus?
Well, because you'd be mad, you'd be dismissed as a mad person, and I don't know, people, I guess nobody wants to be thought of as mad, I mean, I think there's something intensely cruel, by the way, about leaking these tweets, not least because the judge said, go our separate ways, and we did. I didn't even write anything about the conclusion of the trial months ago, and I think there's a hypocrisy here, actually, because in our current culture, it's very therapeutic. It's all about, mental health. But actually, the reality of poor mental health is often really extreme and unpleasant thoughts. It's unpleasant behaviour. It's inappropriate comments. And there seems to be little sympathy. There's no sympathy for me in doing this. There's no sympathy for the person I was having this horrible hallucination on the bus. I immediately sought medical help, by the way. I went to see a psychiatrist. I was referred to a psychiatrist. You know, I was in a terrible state. Like, there's no doubt about it. It's horrible for me to think about, actually. It took me months to recover from this episode.
Do you feel better now?
Generally, yes. I think that becoming a Christian actually has helped me enormously. I wasn't a Christian when I was writing these WhatsApp. I was a very upset person who'd been basically abandoned by, well, as I saw it, my friends, who probably weren't my friends.
I first met you probably 2019 or relatively shortly after that. You were definitely very scarred by that whole sort of cancellation experience. It feels like a lot of people who've gone through that are permanently changed by it because it alters your sense of who you can trust and what relationships really are.
I think so. And you know, I truly believe that people are good, or they can be good. You know what I mean? And I think it shakes you when you have these kind of experiences. I mean, you find out who your friends are. Daniel was someone I used to know, and then I re-met again randomly, and he was my friend. He helped me. You know, so I knew he was my friend. I trusted him, and that's why I defend him also, because I know that he's not what people are saying. I know that I'm not what, is being said about me either. So I have that trust in myself. I have the faith in myself. I also have faith in God, and I didn't have it in 2018. I was much more broken then.
When did you become a Christian?
About 3 years ago. So I was confirmed and baptised last year, properly. And I've done confession, and I'm a member of an Anglo-Catholic church, which is a strange compromise, but it's a beautiful church, and I very much love and admire my priests, and I go to church every Sunday and I pray every day. And also in relation to addiction issues, this is an ongoing question. I'm not perfect. I'm extremely flawed, like everybody. I'm broken. I have these potential problems, but it doesn't mean I can't choose to do something about it. You know what I mean? Yes, it's a daily effort, but there's, there are like AA, there's like support. I mean, it's amazing actually how like beautiful the world is. And I actually got so much support over this latest thing, when people saw what was happening, they could see this thing being presented in this way to make me a demon, really, to make me evil.
There's another aspect to those private messages that he leaked that I'd like to ask about, which I recognise from conversations I've had or I've seen take place, where there is almost a sort of edginess. There's an attraction towards seeing how politically incorrect you can be. Basically, there's almost a thrill. That's why I thought the judge writing about a frisson wasn't completely wrong, that there is almost a thrill with sort of how privately transgressive you can be to the cultural mores of the time. And I do think it is quite common in some parts of the discourse. And I would, if I was defending you from these private messages, that's what it sounded like to me. I don't know if you agree with that. You were talking about setting up a new publishing imprint, and you say, okay, we set up our own, no fatties, no women, no homo, etc. That is obviously a joke where you're saying that it would be the kind of opposite of a kind of progressive, inclusive, diverse
but it's
space.
Also,
is that right? Have I interpreted that correctly?
Yeah, first of all, I really would like to reiterate the difference between private messages, and I think one of the things we have to defend above all is privacy. Okay, fine, my privacy has just been sacrificed on the altar of whatever, but, in reality, like having a private life, being able to laugh with a friend, this is vital. Like, an authoritarian regime is one that demands complete transparency, right? And this is what we actually have to protect and resist. And yes, private relationships are going to have code words and jokes.
But
and
that specific code,
yes.
I completely agree with you, and I think everyone watching will agree that you need to have private spaces and you need to be able to make inappropriate jokes with people you trust. This specific kind of politics, which I talked about earlier, which I do think is maybe more common in parts of the right, where there is a thrill about seeing how politically incorrect you can be Do you think that's true? Do you think?
Well, maybe, but what's wrong with that? I mean, like, I think the liberal claims are, like, ridiculous. I mean, they don't make any sense. And I think people can see that increasingly. I think there has been a breakthrough, actually, maybe in the wake of the assassination attempt on Trump. I mean, just to point out about this very specific, like, no fatties, no women. Like, I'm a woman. I was overweight at the time because of, I wasn't looking after myself. And no homo. It's a joke about, actually, maybe you remember, there was a Grindr story from this period where gay men had been putting in their bio or their preferences something like no femmes, no Asians, no fats, right? So the form of the joke here is a reference to this Grindr thing. I don't know if you remember it.
At another point in this conversation, there's an exchange about Mein Kampf. I'm just going to read through the section of the transcript here. You say, I think at some point we need to read Mein Kampf properly, ... He says, lol. You say, seriously, ! I want to understand it. He says, I keep a copy in my study, of course. You say, well, I have one too. I think maybe it's necessary. Daniel says, we can consult. What if we find ourselves agreeing with it, though? Oh my God, he's right about everything! ! Explain that.
Yeah, no, so very specifically, I say at some point, we're being called Nazis constantly, and I'm thinking, I'm a pacifist. I'm against, like, the Führer principle. I'm anti-industrialization. I'm anti-militarization. I'm not a nationalist, right? And yet people are calling me a Nazi and a fascist. Weird. I mean, of course, it's because I'm saying that, like, there are two sexes and women have rights and, we shouldn't be medicalizing and operating on children. That makes me a Nazi. So at some point, I studied history, right? I have a copy of Mein Kampf, recommended that we all read, by the way, in the 90s from my teacher saying, look, in order to understand this stuff, right? Millions of people had a copy of this book. Maybe they didn't read it. I haven't read it, to be clear. I've read the introduction, the scholarly introduction to this book that we were recommended to buy. I say to Daniel, at some point we should read Mein Kampf. If I was already a neo-Nazi or Nazi or whatever, a retro-Nazi, I would have read Mein Kampf, right? The point is I haven't read it at this point, and I haven't read it now. By all accounts, it's pretty boring and repetitive and deranged and awful. The point is to say something like this. We need to understand, right, what is going on here in order to prevent it, in order to understand the minds of crazy people, crazy, murderous, genocidal people.
I wonder whether you think that by making such an atmosphere of taboo around a lot of these questions, and by even saying that you've read Mein Kampf, you open the question of whether you are actually a Nazi, the kind of counter effect is happening. It's almost like you see with Nick Fuentes and some of these genuinely, I would say, anti-Semitic kind of characters that come up online. What starts as an ironic gesture of trying to prove that you can smash the liberal orthodoxy or say the unsayable then becomes a genuine political movement. I wonder if you think that's true, that by making things so politically hard to say, we are almost sort of bringing to pass the very thing that your people are trying to ban.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's quite likely. I mean, had we had a much more liberal, open-minded, critical discussion of supposedly taboo ideas, not in order to justify them. And I think a lot of this is people pretending to be stupid. I don't think people really look at my private chat where I say I'm a Nazi now, lol, and think that's a genuine confession. They're pretending they do because they want to tie me to some bad politics and therefore discredit the gender critical movement. That's what's really going on.
These private WhatsApp messages have been leaked, and as I understand it, they led to you losing your job.
I offered to step back, and they accepted my resignation.
But that in some way connected to these WhatsApp messages?
Connected to the heat around them, and to be fair to Compact, who, by the way, rescued me from my previous cancellation, where I was unemployed for 3 years, in fact, which is not a very nice place to be in some ways. Compact asked me to join them, and that was very kind of them, actually. And they did, I worked really hard for them, and actually I think I wrote quite a few good articles and, did editing and emails and stuff. And they were always very professional, always very thoughtful. I didn't want to undermine their project, right? I think that what they're doing in some ways is very important. And, it was this idea of a heterodox place where precisely people could say different things from different perspectives without being cancelled. I think probably by nature, I am a bit of a liability. I'm not very institutional. I left my academic jobs and all the jobs that I wasn't dropped from or cancelled or fired from. I stepped back from. I'm difficult to employ, and the fact that I did 2 years with Compact is quite an achievement, actually. And to be honest, being kind of professional and talking about sort of tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles is difficult for me. It's not really my thing, but I wish them very well. And I offered to step back. Okay. They didn't have to accept my resignation. They did. I don't necessarily think it was the right move in the sense that it gives ammunition to this kind of tactic, which I don't approve of. And we've published loads of articles saying why cancel culture is bad, and also how we thought it was on the wane. Maybe this is the last hurrah of cancel culture. I also... So you weren't able to retain your position one way or the other at a publication which is dedicated to opposing cancel culture. Yes.
At the very least shows that it's still there.
Yes, and maybe we were optimistic. But I think we also have to be specific. This is one guy leaking my chats, right? And of course, people join in, there's a mob effect. It's very difficult in the middle of a mob to do a careful account, as I tried to do on my Substack, of what's actually happening. So I couldn't really explain to Compact what was going on. There wasn't enough time. Everything becomes really, really hectic and manic. And it's very difficult to say, well, I meant this and this and this. And actually, it was Luke's decision. Luke has agency. These did not drop from the sky. He chose to publish these.
Do you regret offering your resignation?
No, because I do support the project. And, it was good of them to employ me in the first place. And, maybe there were other disagreements, perhaps around online anonymity and things like that. And, there's a kind of respectability that Compact are going for, which I get completely. JD Vance is now the Trump's VP. There's a lot of stuff going on in America that I'm not fully aware of. And I think fundamentally I'm not really that interested in politics. And they are. And if you are, then you have to be strategic and logistic and all of that.
In that Substack,
yeah,
you talk about the fact that they can't take your books from you.
Yes.
And that even in a bankruptcy, people don't take your books unless they are valuable first editions, which you didn't have any of.
Yeah.
And then you include a picture of your bookshelves with the caption, "Here are some books." I just want to look at the books that you chose to include in that. So it includes Ivan Illich, a couple of those, Max Stirner, The Ego and His Own. There's a book about race and race history and other essays, which is Rosenberg, Gobineau, a primer on Italian fascists from Perito to Gentile, more Ivan Illich, Joseph de Maistre, the St. Petersburg dialogues. So did you choose those books as a kind of ironical final fingers up at the liberal movement that you were opposed to from the beginning? What are you trying to communicate by those books? It seemed to me like even now, when you've gone through all of this, you can't resist a bit of a, yes, I'm still reading edgy, politically unacceptable, right-wing seeming books, so screw you all.
Well, I think the actually serious point that I'm making there is that the Roots of the Right series, compiled by the late George Steiner, who is a Jewish liberal intellectual, who's saying we need to read difficult, disagreeable, horrible, racist, right-wing literature in order to precisely to understand how these movements take hold. That was the entire point of the series. And like I'm saying, this used to be a liberal and even left-wing position, that we would read people that we disagreed with so that we could understand their arguments, the better to counter them. Do you see what I mean?
is there not something slightly disingenuous about using that? I completely understand that position. The only reason you would read these books is because they're so awful and we need to understand their arguments so we can better defeat them. That's what you've just said, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But it would also be okay to say that you find them interesting.
For sure.
And you think they have ideas in amongst the not very good ideas that you think have merit. Is that true?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I'm sort of repeating what George Steiner was doing with the series. But yeah, I mean, but I do think, as you were saying before, like if the more we make things taboo, you're not allowed to talk about X, Y, and Z, the more attractive these ideas are going to become, and the more kind of, let's say, I don't know, sort of provocatively presented they're going to be, as opposed to having a kind of serious critical discussion about them and about the history of extreme ideas. There are extreme ideas on the left too. You can go and hear leftists. I heard some leftists the other day talking about how they wanted to gulag people and murder them and so on, right? We know that people said this about Trump. It can't be okay for some group of people, because they're deemed to be good according to the current ideological order, to run around saying that murder is fine or, mass killing is fine. But the moment someone else jokes about it, who is the wrong kind of person, then it suddenly becomes completely inappropriate. Either we say it's completely wrong to threaten death or even to joke about it for everybody, but it can't be okay for some people and not for others.
What I'd love to hear or better understand before I let you go is what those threads in these kind of thinkers are that you think are worth closer study and may have wisdom. This is the danger zone, to actually say not, okay, it must be legitimate on the grounds of education and normal free speech to read these books and better understand them. I don't think that's controversial at all, but I want to hear, what about these fascist thinkers are you attracted by, and what do you think they got right?
Well, I mean, I think, to be honest, there's all kinds of ideas going on in all of these thinkers. I mean, I think de Maistre, for example, the idea of providence is very important and very interesting. It's something that Nick Land, who I actually encouraged to write for Compact and publish some amazing pieces for Compact, talks about solemn providence, and he rereads the kind of the history of the Western canon through the King James Bible. And Conrad and all of these sorts of things. I think providence is very interesting, because de Maistre is trying to understand why the French Revolution happened, right? If God's plan is good and so on, why would something that tears history apart in this way, how could it possibly fit into our understanding of the unfolding of human history and chronology and time and so on? So, for example, with the idea of providence, I think Ivan Illich, who's not by any stretch of the imagination could be counted as right-wing. I think he's more of a kind of renegade Catholic anarchist, to be honest. He
has quite a big online following nowadays.
Yeah, because precisely his work around medical nemesis and the idea of iatrogenesis, doctor caused harm, and the way in which medicine was being used as an institution to kind of capture and create sick subjects. This is just, by the way, a random selection.
I'd love to see the other shelves.
I have some fantastic books.
What about the Italian fascists? Because you make a particular study of those. You're quite an expert on.
No. I wouldn't say I was an expert at all. But I mean, something like Mussolini. Italian fascism is very interesting. It's not what Hitler did with it, which was actually became much more violent, much more explicitly anti-Semitic. Mussolini started off as a left-winger, right, for one thing. And I think one thing we have to also think about is authoritarianism in general. Like, regardless of whether we say it's left-wing or right-wing, what we're actually talking about is not left and right in some ways. We're talking about the difference in the relationship between those people who want to censor, cancel, police.
And you would put Mussolini in that group?
Well, I think the Italian regime gets steered by Hitler. I think there's some very interesting stuff in Futurism, D'Annunzio, like these kind of precursors, and even rivals, actually, to Mussolini around this period of the early 20th century, both artistically and politically. And yeah, I mean, we should be able to hold ideas in our head and play with them with friends, not in public necessarily, although why not? Why, if you go on Substack now, There's some incredible work being done. People are really thinking through these ideas, all of these ideas that are forbidden in very careful, very beautiful, very poetic ways, occasionally provocative. We have to be able to do that in order to come to some sort of understanding of who we are. And human beings do have a dark side. I'm not denying that there's kind of darkness. I don't think I'm darker than anyone else particularly. I think we should watch Pasolini and read the Marquis de Sade and, read extremist literature of all kinds.
So do you think what's different about you is that you acknowledge that darkness and celebrate it?
I don't think I'm the only person who acknowledges that darkness, but I think we have to, in order to understand why we would witch hunt people, or why we would censor them, why we would spy on them, why we want to create enemies, and a lot of this is about scapegoating. It's like, I've basically been sort of sacrificed twice. My friend Pierre said, what kind of religions crucify somebody twice, and I say that as a joke, not because I really think I'm comparable in any way to Christ. There is a deeper anthropological question here, many anthropological questions. What happens when we forget about the symbolic nature of sacrifice? And online is like this virtual space, like we think it's not real, even though these things have real material consequences. People lose their jobs, they become bankrupt, they're socially ostracized. So who are the people doing the kind of the censoring and the cancelling? Right, none of this is through, any sort of criminal procedure. This is not like saying, okay, this person is being brought before, this is all happening in this kind of grey area of like public opinion. So who are these people seeking to control public opinion? Who are the people editing Wikipedia? Who are the people kind of saying this is far right? And therefore, a lot of these words are like magic words. If you call somebody a Nazi, if you call them a fascist, if you call them a transphobe, whatever, you are putting a little black mark on them and saying to other people, stay away from him, stay away from her.
Should we read your selection of books that you just put on Substack recently as an act of defiance and a message that you're saying you're not going to shrink back from these ideas, you're not going to stop studying them, talking about them in however bold a way you want? Is that right? Are you saying you've been cancelled twice, you're now kind of
I'm totally
invincible?
Free. I'm the freest person.
Nina, thanks for telling us the story today.
Thanks, Freddie.
That was Nina Power, writer and philosopher who has gone through something like a public shaming in recent weeks and months. I almost feel like we recorded a testimonial for posterity there, a little demonstration in miniature of the strangeness and intensity of the age we're living through right now. Thanks to her, and thanks to you for tuning in. This was UnHerd.